We are joined by a special guest, Ayoub Khan, MP for Birmingham. How has it been for you in terms of, has life been turned upside down for, I don't know, whichever way, different lifestyle change, whole culture change? How has it been?
Yeah, so being a parliamentarian is different, very different.
24/7 job?
It is quite demanding, and I think to an extent when I walk down from the flat, which is not very far from the House of Commons, when you're walking over the bridge and you look at Parliament, you do have this, it's surreal. You think to yourself, gosh, I've been supported by the local communities to represent their views in that Parliament. Someone who grew up in Little Aston. When I say Little Aston, I'm not talking about Little Aston, St. Coffee, I'm talking about...
Welcome to the Art of Living podcast, and today we dive into the world of politics because we are joined by a special guest who is making waves in the world of UK politics and inshallah international politics. But he is an MP and has been an MP since the last general election, and he has brought a breath of fresh air, new vision, new leadership, new ideas to the table. And he is Ayoub Khan, MP for Birmingham Perry Barr. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
Jazakallah, and it's an honor and pleasure to be hosting you. Last time we actually met and spoke was just before the election, when you were literally, contesting the election to become an MP. And no doubt your world has changed since last July, since becoming an MP.
It has. I mean, that last interview was about 10 months ago.
Yeah.
And 10 months ago, I've flown really quickly. I mean, it just feels like I was here yesterday. That's how quick it's gone. But alhamdulillah, we did exceptionally well, as you know. We unseated Khalid Mahmood, someone who's been in Parliament for 20 odd years.
Who seems as if he still hasn't got over that defeat.
I think it's very hard when you've got a routine. If you have a routine for 20 years, then breaking that routine must be very difficult.
Sure, I'm sure. But how has it been for you in terms of, has life been turned upside down for, I don't know, whichever way, different lifestyle change, whole culture change? How has it been?
Yeah, so being a parliamentarian is different, very different.
24/7 job?
It is quite demanding, and I think to an extent when I walk down from the flat, which is not very far from the House of Commons, when you're walking over the bridge and you look at Parliament, you do have this, it's surreal. You think to yourself, gosh, I've been supported by the local communities to represent their views in that Parliament. Someone who grew up in Little Aston. When I say Little Aston, I'm not talking about Little Aston, St. Coffee, I'm talking about the small
inner city
area of Aston, having...
But did you ever have that vision or goal that as a kid that you're going to be a parliamentarian, or that something that just came about later on in life?
Well, I never thought I'd be sitting in the mother of all democratic houses. And I think it's fate. What happens in and around your community, what happens around in your country, what happens around in the world, and the passion that you have to be a driver, to be able to express the views of the service, the communities that you service. And I think it was just a path that came into being, as opposed to me thinking, well, I'm going to be a parliamentarian, I want to be sitting in the House of Commons. It was just a path that was drawn out by what was happening in and around the world, in and around the communities.
One of the things I really wanted to truly understand as a new MP, when you walked through those corridors of power, what was the reaction you got from other MPs? Obviously, look, we can't deny the fact you're a Muslim MP, right? We still live in a country which still has institutional racism. And you're an independent one. You were seen as somebody who were riding on that wave of the Palestinian issue. And did you get any flack for that? Did you get any negative reactions from others?
Surprisingly not. What you have to understand is that in Parliament, all MPs are very respectful. We can all agree to disagree, and obviously at my 9 months in Parliament, I've met pretty much a large number of MPs, whether it's in the corridors of power, whether it's sitting in the chamber, whether it's in any of the APPG groups where cross-party politicians come together. They've all been very pleasant, and I think initially you feel a little reserved because you think, just because of the points that you raise, that you're an independent MP, that
no backing of a big party.
Absolutely. And so you think to yourself that this is an old boy or stroke girls club, and you're not meant to be there. And the fact that you are there, you'll be seen as an outsider. And to a degree, you feel that some of that is at play because you're an independent, and so you'll get that naturally within the sort of different party politics. But ultimately, I think we've had very friendly conversations with every MP, and that's all parties, including Reform.
Really? Okay. I mean, the people have this perception that, these are warring factions in the House of Commons. Labour probably doesn't like the Conservatives, and the Conservatives don't like the Labour. But probably the fact is they're good friends, many of them anyway.
Yeah, I mean, look, you can have your political differences. Yeah. And, when it comes to policies, when it comes to communities that you represent and the issues which are impacting them, you're going to hold firmly on your position. But in terms of just people and socializing, everybody gets on really well. And I think there's no difference in what happens in Parliament that takes place in, let's say, the council house here in Birmingham. You get on with every councillor, and in the same way, MPs just get on a very social level. But when it comes to policy, you will find that they'll fight tooth and nail.
How have you dealt with the criticism that you are an MP for Gaza because of the obviously Palestinian issue? The momentum of that has allowed you to become victorious, and your own predecessor has said that if it wasn't for the Palestinian issue, you wouldn't have been able to ride on that wave and get elected.
I think that's disingenuous coming from Khalid Mahmood for a number of reasons. First of all, I won with, I think it was 13,000 and some votes. So 13,500, let's say. I don't know the exact numbers. I mean, I was just pleased with the victory. I didn't care about...
Even if you won by one vote?
Even by one vote, it didn't make no difference to me. But I've fought 2 previous general elections where I've taken about 10,000 votes. Mm-hmm. So the increase in 3,000 votes came about primarily, I believe, because of the extra work that I've been doing as a councillor within the Aston ward. But I'm not taking and downplaying the foreign policy issue. Of course, foreign policy plays a big part in lives of every voter, and it must do. Ultimately, if I've won the election because, A, people felt that our foreign policy, when it came to the lives of Palestinians, was an important matter to them, they're entitled to vote on that policy issue. And so being labelled as a Gazan MP, well, I often say that Keir Starmer's not labelled as a Ukrainian Prime Minister. The MPs that support the Ukrainian position don't get labelled as Ukrainian MPs. And so,
or even Israel,
or Israeli MPs or Israeli spokespeople, they're seen as democratically elected parliamentarians, and they are expressing a view. And so it's sad, but it shows you the challenges that you have. Mm. Even mainstream media, like the BBC, have said pro-Gazan MP. Why does that title even need to be there? You're an MP, you're democratically elected in a seat within the United Kingdom. And so your issue, whatever it may be, which is being raised in Parliament, should be the highlight. But that shouldn't...
I think there's a narrative being painted here that you're a one-trick pony, and you basically, if it wasn't for Gaza, you probably wouldn't be here. So for some reason, your victory can be painted as a bit of a fluke.
Even if that was true, which I genuinely believe wasn't the case in my election, because, as I've said, I've taken substantial votes historically. But even if that was true, so what? Mm-hmm. The fact is, in a democratic society, people that get elected and their views must be respected. You may disagree with them, But ultimately, the views must be respected. And from my perspective, I've not just spoken about what's taking place in Gaza. I mean, if anything, if you want to label me as the MP for humanity. Because wherever there is oppression, wherever there is injustice,
it's our duty to speak
it's
up.
our duty to speak up when it comes to equality, fairness, and just those are fundamental principles that I've grown up with. And so I think that the fact that we have media constantly referring to that particular narrative is in an attempt to undermine the fact that you are democratically elected for a whole constituency, which has a whole host of issues. And I've raised issues around, for example, the pensioners being stripped of their fuel allowance, the £300 which you were getting. I've spoken about child poverty, which is a massive problem in my constituency. But all of the topics I've spoken about seem to be absorbed into a transparency which nobody or no mainstream media want to talk about.
So you've recently been also embroiled in controversy regarding your statement on child grooming gangs, which obviously is a big hot topic in relation to Pakistani Muslim communities. So how did that get you into trouble with the press?
Well, this was something picked up by GB News and Talk TV. I was at a conference, and what I was telling the audience was that there are false narratives out there which stoke tensions within communities, specifically done to sow division. I've made my position very clear in terms of child sexual exploitation. I've said that all communities, it doesn't really come down to ethnicity, religion or race. Whoever's responsible for this vile act ought to be prosecuted, and there needs to be focus on the victims. That's my statement in Parliament in broad terms. But what happened here was my statement was taken out of context, and there was a suggestion made by some of the presenters saying, oh, Ayoub Khan as an MP is saying that grooming gangs and the act of executing child exploitation, sexual exploitation, was a false narrative. I've never said that. I've always made my position very clear. But Khalid Mahmood then came on, I think it was Talk TV, and made some comments.
GB News, I think.
GB News, yeah. Probably GB or one of the two Talk TVs. But made some very strong and adverse comments in relation to my statement. And I felt that it was wholly disingenuous because he's allowed this tsunami, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of views on that video, and people criticizing without actually knowing what my factual position is.
But that's the job of the press, isn't it? To take things out of context and to twist the narrative to suit their narrative. Twist the story to suit their narrative. And obviously they found a friend in Khalid Mahmood, and obviously many would say that's just sour grapes. He's just on your heels just to try and bring you down because of what you've unseated him. And as you mentioned at the beginning. But going back to this main issue of, press having a narrative which they push out, which is not necessary, as you quite rightly said. Let's even focusing on child abuse and these grooming gangs. Why is it that the Muslim, the Pakistani gangs have been highlighted as the main perpetrators? But statistically, it's been proven that child abuse happens across the board, and majority of the perpetrators are non-Muslims.
And as I've said before many a times, never let the facts get in front of a good news story.
Yeah.
My objective and point is very clear. It's a criminal act. People need to be prosecuted. And that's what this is about. To label a whole community. I mean, you got to appreciate that, and as I've said before, that there's always ramifications for statements that are made, politicians that make statements that are unwarranted, which don't tie up with the facts. I'm not saying that this crime does not occur in a specific community. It occurs across all communities. In fact, the data is not very clear in any event. There's no real data that you can rely heavily upon because the way the reports were made, information not being collected properly. But the point is that by labeling a single community, what are you trying to achieve? Other than...
It's dangerous.
It's very dangerous. What are you trying to achieve? Because you have close to 2 million individuals living in this country that have heritage in Pakistan. What are you trying to suggest? That this was a cultural problem? And if there's a very, very, very small minority that commits a particular crime, why aren't the rest doing it? That's because,
and why is there religion brought into
well, and this is, as I say, it's done to sow division in communities, and far right pick up on it because they want to tarnish a whole community. And in the very same way, the issue around the airport, nobody was asking the British taxpayer to pay a single penny towards an airport.
Sorry, which airport are you talking about?
In Islamabad, in Azad
Oh,
Kashmir.
the recent, I think another parliamentarian, Tahir Ali, was embroiled into that controversy.
Yeah, it was. And and once again, Tahir Ali should have rectified the misunderstanding, the misinformation around that. As parliamentarians, we speak about all topics. We speak about anything which our constituents raise. For example, recently, I've had a large number of constituents talking about the driving agency for driving tests. People can't get appointments, so I'm going to be raising that in Parliament. So any issue that's brought to me, if it's impacting my constituents, or if my constituents wants me to raise it, if it's a reasonable issue, of course I'm going to raise it. So in the same vein, where you've got British Kashmiris that are saying we want you to lobby parliamentarians in Pakistan and in Azad Kashmir and say that this is something that we want. Of course, parliamentarians are going to write to the Prime Minister of Pakistan, the Prime Minister of Azad Kashmir.
So this is your constituents in your area in the UK asking you to lobby the authorities in Pakistan for an airport in Pakistan.
Absolutely. So if your constituents say that this would alleviate issues. There's a lot of robberies that take place when you go from Islamabad to Azad Kashmir en route, and so they're saying, well, we don't want to go through that path, we don't want to go through that journey, and so the bottom line is, if it's not impacting the taxpayer in any financial, I mean, we're running a deficit in this country anyway. Why should it make big news? What's so significant about an MP which is supporting the constituents they're serving?
I think when I read about that, I think going back to the Tahir Ali issue, that he is spending time and energy trying to advocate for an airport in Pakistan when he's got huge problems on his own doorstep. It's like the bin strikes and the rubbish accumulating on the street. So this is what people picked up on, which on the face of it, it's a very legitimate complaint that people have raised.
I don't disagree with that aspect of it, because there was two connotations. The first one was about British taxpayers paying for it, but
that was never the issue.
Yeah, but that was a issue. Certainly in
I mean, that's not the fact.
Well, yeah, that's not a fact. So the fact is that this is something that doesn't impact the British taxpayer in one way or another. But what is legitimate is raising issues that impact your communities. And we had, I mean, the strike is still ongoing, but we had a massive health issue here in Birmingham. We still don't know what impact that rubbish which was lying around on streets in terms of causing illness, because we haven't got the information yet. But that was a legitimate complaint. I mean, I asked the Prime Minister directly about the problems that we were having here in Birmingham.
Surely it's a Birmingham City Council problem, isn't it? So what can the Prime Minister do to alleviate a bin strike in Birmingham?
Very good point. What happened was that once I had asked the Prime Minister about what he was going to do with Birmingham and the issues that we were having, because Birmingham-run council, which is a Labour-run council, were incompetent, the Deputy Prime Minister was sent in, and she made 2 visits. And after those 2 visits, along with the Minister responsible, Jim McMahon, we've seen action. We've seen the rubbish being collected. I'm not saying that it's resolved the problem, because it hasn't. We still have bins, recyclable waste which is not being collected. We still have a lot of mess on our streets, but at least there's been movements. There's not the piles of rubbish that we've seen on Sky News and other BBC outlets. So there was a reaction, and the reaction comes about, and that's why I feel that an independent MP is probably the most powerful MP sitting in the House of Commons.
Really? That's probably contrary to majority opinion.
Yeah, well, and this bin saga demonstrated it, in my view, because a single MP raising an issue in Parliament which sent shockwaves, not just in Parliament, not just in UK, but across the world. Because this is a developed country, and in a developed country, you've got street scenes which you wouldn't even see in developing countries.
It's quite
And so
disgusting.
it was, and it was embarrassing. And there was a reaction, and that reaction resulted in action. And as a single MP, independently elected, I was able to influence, I'm confident, what we now see. So, you know, when people said, well, what can an independent MP do? That's just a testament of what you can achieve.
Is that because you don't have like a chief whip to, you know, whip you into action or admonish you for saying the wrong thing? You're completely free to, you know, say whatever you want, motion any, table any motion that you want, or ask any question?
There's only one control mechanism, and that's people.
Yeah.
That's true democracy.
Yeah.
I mean, just think about it. Child benefit. The cap on child benefit impacts every constituency in Birmingham, pretty much. And yet, you look at Ladywood constituency MP Shabana Mahmood, you look at Hall Green, Tyre Ali, you look at Hodge Hill, Liam Byrne. These four constituencies, including mine, have some of the highest child poverty. And you had the three MPs representing some of the most deprived communities support that cap. And I was the only MP which said, holy one, that's not fair.
Is it because they were obviously towing a party line?
Absolutely. They're not serving the constituents, because the stats show you that you've got more than 40% of your children live in child poverty, if not close to 50%. And you are supporting a policy that drives those children further down the poverty scale.
Just on that point, obviously, as a Muslim MP, when you stand up in the House of Commons during Prime Minister's questions times, all eyes would be on you in the sense that you're seen as a representative of a Muslim community. Would you say that's an added pressure on you as to, you know, when you literally open your mouth to say anything, because it'll be picked up on and, you know, scrutinized more heavily?
Well, anything you do say, it gets labelled in social media, in mainstream media, as you've highlighted earlier on, Gazan MP, Muslim MP, you know, these are the sort of narratives that you read about. And of course, as a Muslim, when you stand up in Parliament, when you speak, when you ask questions, it is on the back of the mind that you're an ambassador. Of course, as a Muslim, you know, I'd like to think that I'm an ambassador for the Muslim community, and that's reflected in the ethics and work ethics that I deploy. And so when I get up, there's that pressure, and of course I represent my constituents and their views, but I can't take away the perception by many out there as to what they really see.
So, you know, you've obviously joined up with Jeremy Corbyn and created this independent Alliance of MPs. What power have you guys got, in the sense that, I mean, as independents, you really do, which is a fact, that have very limited power to be able to push any legislation through Parliament. So how effective are you guys as that small group of independent MPs?
So people actually want to see and hear people and parliamentarians talk the truth. So often parliamentarians will tiptoe between raindrops because they don't want to cause unsettling within the communities. But I firmly believe that it is important to raise matters that, to me, are evidentially very clear. And so I will not shy away from raising those matters in Parliament. And I think it's important to do so, because whilst you're not delivering any policy change, people are hearing a viewpoint which they agree with. And so as long as we're raising that, as long as we're holding the government to account, I think we are doing our job and supporting the views of tens of thousands, if not millions of people across the world, but in specific in the UK.
But as an independent, do you ever have any attempts of any pressure being trying to be exerted upon you, or you're not being given the opportunity to speak in the House of Commons, or any such issues which you feel that you face that which other mainstream parliamentarians may not face?
I think we've been treated very fairly in Parliament.
Yeah.
We've been given sufficient opportunities to raise questions, to participate in debate.
That's positive to hear.
That is very positive. And I think there was an apprehension that that may not be the case, but we've had our fair share of Parliament time as MPs, as the Independent Alliance group. So whether that translates into actual policy change, time will tell, because I can tell you that there are many, many more MPs now when it comes to the recognition of Palestine, when it comes to the issue of human rights abuses and violations. There are so many MPs that are now very vocal.
That's what I wanted to ask you. Are you cross-party? Are you seeing that the reality, people are waking up to the reality? Parliamentarians who have probably towed the official line for a long time, now seeing that, hang on, we really need to break this false narrative that the mainstream has been pushing about Israel being the victim.
I think the people have now realized, parliamentarians in specific, you can only pull wool over the eyes of the public for so long. The public are not blind. Recently, we know that 15 paramedics were executed.
Yeah.
If that happened in any other country, can you imagine if that happened in the UK? What would be the repercussion? If that happened in Ukraine, what would the outcry look like? 15 paramedics, hands tied in shallow graves. And the nonsense that Israel came out with, and still comes out with. As a barrister, we, from a very embryonic stage of our profession, look at evidence and test that evidence analytically. So the first event and the version of events that the Israeli government spokespeople put out there was that these ambulances were approaching that particular location discreetly and suspiciously, and that's why they opened fire. Nobody had assumed that one of the individuals would be carrying a mobile phone and had recorded the whole incident. So when that came about,
They changed their story quickly.
they had to change the story. And it's shocking that people would believe the nonsense they come out with, that actually there were Hamas fighters within the ambulance now. So why lie about it in the first place? Not only did they bury the paramedics, but they also buried the ambulances. Now, why would you want to bury evidence unless you've acted like the mafia? And that was mafia-style execution and the getting rid of evidence.
One thing I wanted to ask you, you've actually entered politics in a very strange, most weirdest and interesting times, where the two-party system seems to have been broken up now, where there's the rise of the independents and new parties like Reform emerging, and there's even a discussion about the Tories having some sort of a coalition with Reform, which would have been unthinkable many years ago. Even like 5 years ago, this would have been unthinkable that anything like this could even possibly happen. So what's your sort of prognosis or prediction as to where we're heading?
I don't think the Tories will ever form a coalition with Reform.
But look at the way they...
Yet, on one view, it seems to be who can sit furthest to the right in terms of policies. I mean, you just have to listen to the nonsense that Jenrick comes out with and Kemi Badenoch come out with, referring to the independents as sectarians. You know, it's just absolute nonsense. But my take on it is that the Tories, if they ever went into coalition with Reform, that'd be the end of Tories. It's almost political suicide for the Conservative Party to do that.
Well, what do you make of the rise of parties like Reform?
Whether that will materialize into actual seats, I think, will be very difficult. I mean, the way our first past the post system operates.
That's why they want to change it to proportional representation.
Well, absolutely. And I'm in favor of that.
Proportional representation.
Absolutely.
I agree.
I think proportional representation would be effective. Whether that's going to change in this government's time, I don't think it's likely. That
because what's happened is the two-party system has maintained that status quo because it favoured them.
And now to change that policy would be political suicide for the main political parties.
Yeah.
Let's face it. But I don't think reform, despite what we see in the polls, will translate into significant seats for them. I think that they will take a number of seats. It's hard to gauge precisely how many, but I don't think they'll take more than 50 seats. But I equally think that independents will take somewhere in the same region if we continue our performance where the average fair-minded observer sees the work that the Independent Alliance are doing in terms of child benefit, in terms of winter fuel allowance, in terms of the £5 billion further cuts which are going to be impacting the most vulnerable in our society. We've been very strong advocates on what's happened to the WASPy women, the compensation. So as the Independent Alliance, we've spoken about those topics and supported the people that get impacted in a way that I don't believe any other parliamentarian has done.
Do you find it alarming that across Europe, there's a sweeping sort of far-right ideology creeping into mainstream politics? And obviously, as I've mentioned a short while ago, now that we're witnessing that in the UK as well, the Tory party itself seems to be dancing to the tunes of far-right activists just to show them that we're on your side, so keep, voting for us.
And I think a lot of that's driven by social media. And when you look at X and other platforms, I often look at the messages and I just do a quick search on the profile of that individual, and it seems to me that it's an AI bot. And the reason why I say that is because they've only subscribed to X in 2024, 2025. So a lot of what we are witnessing in terms of social media, and that's where I think there needs to be more
regulation.
Regulation, but activity from all communities to participate in social media, because I think it's so important to get the views of fair-minded observers and people that want to express where the country should be heading in terms of policy. Because if we don't get that balance, then what you do get is extremist views, which are becoming very popular. Most of them, I think, are driven by AI, artificial intelligence. And fair-minded observers begin to then change their view. And I think there needs to be a balance, a redress on how social media platforms are being used by artificial intelligence. That needs to be dealt with. I think the false narratives that we get
So what you're saying is you're advocating for good, decent people who are champions of humanity to jump onto social media and make their voices heard as well.
Absolutely. We have keyboard warriors, but we also have the silent observers. And I think the silent observers need to participate a little more, because we need to get this parity in terms of where people want to see this government and the policies they'd like to see implemented.
What's your own vision as an independent for the next 5 years?
Well, as I've always said, fairness, justice, equality has always been the foundation blocks of where I've stood. I'd like to see a fair society, and the policies that I support reach out to getting that achieved in terms of, as I said before, child benefit, winter fuel allowance, the recent £5 billion cuts. And I've always said that we can raise money when we need to. We were all recalled back to Parliament in relation to Scunthorpe and the workers there and the job losses that would have occurred if the government didn't bail out and intervene. So we've raised money. I mean, that's costing us a substantial amount of money, the government and the taxpayers. But we don't seem to do the same when we need to look at the most vulnerable and most needy in our society. There are other ways of raising money, and I'd like to think that we can push that agenda and put Keir Starmer and his government on the back foot, and even policies such as the Lord Chancellor trying to change the sentencing guidelines and the pre-sentence report. I mean, those sort of narratives are not helping. I think that's an important topic, mind you, because the pre-sentence report for offenders, the most senior judges of this country said that we need to have within the pre-sentence report recognition of those communities that get a disparity of sentence. They get a harsher sentence than their white counterparts for similar offences.
The Lord Chancellor's trying to abolish pre-sentencing reports.
Well, the cohorts. So, for example, where it says minority communities need to be granted a pre-sentence report before sentence, minority religions, and the like. So what the Sentencing Council has done is looked at the sentencing of offenders up and down the country. They've identified the disparity, and they're trying to address that disparity. This was then raised by the Conservatives as a two-tier policy, and Shabana Mahmood agreed with that. And so there's legislation which is being passed through Parliament as we speak, which would eliminate the minority groups and other cohorts. But I think that's a fatal mistake, because you're going against professional opinion. Lord Justice Davies is a very senior judge. He sits as a chair of the Sentencing Council, and if he's saying that these things need to be included, it's for a purpose. But once again, and it comes back to my point, I'd like to see myself championing fairness, equality and justice. And where I see other people, especially parliamentarians of colour, which should understand the impact the communities have had, the disparities that we envisage, for them then to adopt a narrative which is just based on nonsense.
Unfortunately, as you know, inequality is increasing in our society and communities. The gulf between the rich and the poor is getting bigger and bigger, and the poverty is becoming really, really worse for many people. So no doubt, these are conversations that we'll be having again, because in one parliament, you're never ever going to be able to eliminate these problems. And maybe perhaps, even in one term, we can lay the seeds of change for future generations to be able to have a better, more equal equality in society. But I'd just like to thank you for coming. It's been a great honor and pleasure to host you. And
it's been a pleasure.
Inshallah, we'll have another conversation again soon.
Inshallah. Thank you for hosting me.